Well, welcome everybody. I know it's different not seeing each other, so I appreciate your commitment to learning in uncertain times. I think that speaks a lot to this crew. Really excited to interact with you all and the conference presenters. So I know we don't get as much interaction during the session, but excited to take questions after if that would be helpful. My name's Simon Yost. I hail from St. Louis, Missouri. I've been here for about a decade and grew up in Omaha, Nebraska before that. I've worked in and out of organizations of all shapes and sizes, nonprofits. I've worked in creative agencies and in corporations and groups inside organizations. I've worked in technical consulting with small startups and big companies, and I've worked at startups as well. So I've kind of been all over the place. So hopefully that knowledge kind of distills to you all today. I am a proud foster adopt parent. So that's part of what I enjoy is time with the fam. I do cycling. Excuse me. I'm kind of a coffee person too. I don't know about y'all, but some people went to go get toilet paper when Corona happened. I went to go stock up on coffee. So I don't know what that says about me, but and then one of my hobbies is attempting to use my iPad Pro for as much as possible, which I get heckled about at work all the time. So if you want to make fun of me, one of my coworkers, specifically Matthew Carter, we call him Coach. Shout out, he helped me a lot on this talk, so I just wanted to mention that off the top as well. And we're all out of 1904 Labs in St. Louis. So we're going to kind of look at a few things today as we look at adding design to DevOps. First of all, the drill. What's our responsibility and kind of calling vocation as DevOps engineers? And then a loop. How can we apply some practices of discover, distill, and deliver to bake design into our process and come out with a good result? So that's what we're going to talk about today a little bit. When we talk about what is or why DevOps, what I am suggesting, and normally I would poll the audience and ask y'all because I'm really interested in what everybody else thinks, but we have an opportunity as DevOps engineers to create processes that will enable our teams artifacts to repeatedly add value. So our teams create artifacts and our processes help them deliver over and over and over again. When we talk about what is DevOps, my definition that I'm working with today is that DevOps is the infrastructure and the process that provides continuous value to users and delights them. I think remembering users is really important because so much of what we do and talk about has to do with technology, and really the people that are at the other end of that. Sometimes it feels like our other developers, not necessarily our users of our applications, and who those users are and what roles they play. I understand is very diverse. It's not a one size fits all thing, but just remembering the humans, I think, is critical. And so then if we talk about kind of a little bit of process and project, I was just going to try to whiteboard a little bit. That's why I'm kind of using this crazy design. When we talk about project and process, I don't know if y'all ever use this parlance, but when we talk about projects, like, oh, what project are you on right now at work? And sometimes that can mean like, what client are you on, or what SOW are you on? Different things like that. But oftentimes, process isn't really talked about that much. And if you notice about in the two definitions I just gave, first, why DevOps, I suggested that it's an opportunity to create processes that will enable our team's artifacts to repeatedly add value. So the create processes part. And then what is DevOps? The infrastructure and process that provide continuous value to delight users. And so the reason that I use process there is because classically a project is meant to stop. And most of our projects don't stop. They don't stop believing. And normally when they end, it's about money, not about that the project is done. And then if you consider process, what I define process is a repeatable, sorry, I wrote it down. A process is repeated to achieve a desired result, right? We're repeating something over and over again to get the same, hopefully consistent result. And so what many of us may be actually engaged in our teams is we may be interacting with processes and asked to own processes that we're enhancing. And if you consider that world of what if your team is owning processes that it's asked to be enhancing. Like, why does that matter? Why would I bring this up? Because processes must be sustained. And if you need, if you need a person, whether it's Becca or Joe or, whatever the people are on your team, that's a really big head. Team art, if you need those people on speed dial to make your prod issues go away, then your processes aren't that stable yet. And why that matters is that adding design to this kind of a situation, if this area is where we're adding design, then that being stable is critical to add to it. And so I would encourage you that if you're considering doing something like this, whether it's adding design or any other discipline, any other layer, even a new layer of testing, if your processes, if you're aren't rock solid, and if you're relying on some ninjas for your prod issues to go away, I'd challenge you to shore those up first. And just kind of going back to a big picture why, it's really our responsibility as DevOps engineers to create artifacts that stand the test of time. We are asked to do CI/CD, continual integration, continual deployment, and I'm not trying to be too cheesy, but those things are supposed to happen over and over and over again, and we're able to then offer some pretty cool longevity to these products for our customers. And so just keeping that in mind is important. So I believe that as practitioners of DevOps, we have the responsibility to create these artifacts that will stand the test of time, but also create processes that will enable others to do the same and our team members to do the same. And so then kind of the rest of this talk is, how do we steward that responsibility? How do we go from a world where we have that opportunity to where we're actually taking advantage of it? So note today as we go forward that this is about design, and we'll talk a lot about design examples, but we're also going to use a process with the Discover, Distill, Deliver that you could potentially use to add many different types of disciplines or layers of process to your team or to your world. And so in this talk, we'll use design examples, but let's say that you wanted to add performance testing to your processes. This Discover, Distill, Deliver may work for that as well. Just wanted to throw that out, something to listen for. And so today, as we talk about adding design, normally at this point, I would be thrilled to ask, like, who has added design and how's that going? And hopefully I'll hear about that more after the talk. But when we talk about design, I think it could really be two things. One is we could be talking about visual design, and that's the look and feel of our application and what our users really see. And two is kind of design thinking is how it's been called. Around this idea of human-centered design, or HCD. And so a story from that is that last October, I did a talk with the same title, Adding Design to DevOps. And basically what I did was I zoomed in on number one and really talked about practically how are we going to do this visual design stuff. I really challenged people on some very specific and practical ways. But what I realized was that I was doing this design thinking for them. And what happened is, I think that people really didn't see the opportunity. They didn't see how to adjust things for themselves because I was kind of skipping over it. So that was really interesting to me. I remembered that quote, give a man a fish and you'll feed him for a day, teach a man to fish and you'll feed him for a lifetime. So I realized I was fishing for y'all. And so today I've reworked a lot of this with some coworkers' advice to a primer on teaching y'all to fish, so to speak, which is a primer on this kind of human-centered design thinking with this visual stuff in mind. So I can point people to that other talk that I gave that gets really prescriptive, but hopefully this gives you a toolkit to think through how to take in these requests we're getting from all over our organizations and actually implement them, starting with design. So the first thing that we'll talk about today, if I can get the page to flip, is discover. We just talked about the drill, is discover. And so the discover piece that is really important is that we're going to bring intentional discovery, and that's going to make our solutions better. So Coach is this coworker I referred to. I wanted to quote him. because this was one of the things we really zoomed in on in our conversation when we were analyzing my previous talk together. Being intentional about this discovery thing is one of the things we most often skip over, and for good reason, right? It takes some time and takes some effort, but one of the opportunities is that there's multiple types of discovery, and that might help us understand what type of discovery we need. So the first type I'm calling is greenfield. And the idea is that this is when there's something totally new. So greenfield is something that has never existed before, a new product or service or a new type of solution. That is how that's one type of discovery. Another thing that HCD recommends and that you'll see a lot of people talking about is as is and to be. So there's this other type of discovery where you're taking the current state that you need to document that so that you understand where you currently are, and then you're also documenting the state of where you want to be. And so this really clearly then defines the opportunity, right? The gap between the as is and the to be is what you're going to look for solutions to implement. And this is very powerful because it aligns everybody on both of those bookends, and then your team is free to work between them. I think a good example of this as is and to be that is real, I think about a lot, and it's a fun business story, is in Creativity Inc., written by Ed Catmull, who's the founder of Pixar, or one of the founders of Pixar, and he talks about this idea of the brain trust. All of the brilliant directors that we have come to know and love over the last few decades at Pixar coming into a room and watching scripts, screening, storyboards of movies that are in development at Pixar. And he talks about how the brain trust job is to talk about the problem, not the solutions. So their job is to poke holes in the script or the preview of the movie that they're seeing to find the things that really need attention. And then it's the job of the director and their team to solve those problems. And the reason I bring this up is because if you leave a room of those brilliant people and know what the problems are, you're pretty sure that you're going to come up with, you know, a better movie. But so often, right, we zoom ahead to the solutions and we potentially minimize the impact of getting alignment on the problems, and we only use that brain trust for the solutions. And so they're really practically talking about, you know, these fresh eyes of the brain trust. Their best use is to really zoom in on and to talk about the gap, and the best use of these brilliant people that they have that are making the movie is to be the solution to that problem. So I think when we talk about the as is and to be, that gives us some great ideas of how to frame up some discovery efforts to really discover what that gap is, if that's our need for discovery. And one of the final types of discovery that I've been involved with, I'm calling a +1. So this is the idea that you have something that's working, that's humming. You may have bugs. I'm not insisting that you don't, but there's something that you want to add. You have a solid thing that's a big thing, and you want to add a piece to it. And I'm calling that +1. And I think that the +1 is a lot of potentially the types of requests we get, and the reason that we call a lot of our things, you know, we talked about project and process in the last screen, and the reason that we call some things projects is because we're adding all of these +1 things, and the +1 things might feel like the features that we did in greenfield, or some of us might have never even been on a greenfield project. It's just since we've come onto the team, we're always doing these +1 things, but really we're just glomming on, right, in a crude way, to this bigger thing. And my idea here is that, not my idea, but the idea with this +1 discovery is that you really understand what the state of the big thing is, what the need of the +1 thing is, and that really helps us implement those things better. So an example of a +1 might be adding a new screen or a new feature. It also might be a layer of testing, right? Maybe you have unit and integration testing, you're going to add system testing, or you have all three of those and you're going to add performance testing. Those might be ideas or suggestions of what a +1 thing might be in your world. So when we talk about what is discovery, the way I'm defining that is we're aligning on a problem or an opportunity before implementing a solution. So aligning on a problem or an opportunity before implementing a solution. And that the key for discovery then is making that opportunity crystal clear. Another thing that I think is important for discoveries is that they're persistent. Um, it's important and critical to get alignment with your team and your stakeholders, and often that happens through meetings. Maybe there's a whiteboard involved. More whiteboards the better. However, if it just stays in that place, it would just be an oral tradition. So that means when that group is no longer there, it won't be there anymore. And I am classically not a fan of taking transcriptive meeting notes. So this is not a call to capture every single thing that was said during the meeting. What I'm talking about is getting the tone, the decision, the alignment, and capturing that in a really helpful way. So maybe it would be a type of documentation we'll talk about in a minute, or maybe it's like a flow chart, or maybe it's a really quick Confluence page that kind of outlines the decisions that were made. But the idea is that with discovery, we're capturing this gap or this need, and then we're going to put it in a persistent place so that everybody can come back to it and remember it. Another thing that I think discovery needs to be impactful is to be catalytic, which is kind of a buzzword, but I think it should create momentum for the team. It should feel like you're starting to go down the hill on the roller coaster, right? It should feel like it's pulling you out of your seat. And the way that you might know that discovery wasn't as successful is if you feel like you're pushing all your team members to the next stage. If you're pushing them towards a solution, if you're kind of feeling like they're fighting the solution, that might mean the discovery wasn't as carefully done. And then finally, that you treat both technology and humans. So often when we're doing our work as DevOps practitioners, technology is front of mind. We have a lot of really keen solutions, and that's one of the brilliant parts about y'all's skill sets is that you're able to really take this, one of the Swiss Army knife pieces, or one of the many tools in your toolbox, and apply the right tools at the right time. And that is key for sure. But I think remembering where the humans come in is also important. And that's kind of where we enter this idea of human-centered design. Human-centered design, or HCD, is an approach to problem solving that involves human perspectives at all steps of the problem solving process. So don't get that confused with the opinions of your colleagues. Those things are valid, but right, you could talk to a colleague, a product owner, a stakeholder about whether to use Docker or not as your container solution. That is not necessarily keeping the humans involved. An example of what that would be, right, is you might be talking about Docker, and you might be talking about the people that will be needing to spin up Docker, or the people that will need to do prod support and interact with Docker. That would be keeping the humans involved. It's not about pleasing your stakeholders necessarily. You want to keep them happy, I assume. You want alignment with them, but it's about thinking about the people that are using the stuff after it's implemented. And that's kind of what we're talking about, keeping the humans in mind. When we talk about human-centered design, often we kind of stereotype it as within the context of a vertical slice. So many of us would prefer to work in a vertical slice. We write user stories often that we'd like to have a vertical slice. A vertical slice might be to have a screen that shows people that are going to win the Stanley Cup this year, like a hockey. St. Louis is a big hockey town, right? So teams that have a chance of winning the Stanley Cup, and you're going to implement that all the way from the front end to the database layer. And so you might, depending on where your software is at, you might need to make tables for teams and tables for players or whatever, right? And then those roll up into APIs, and then those APIs go into a front-end framework, and then you have some design that goes on top of that. All that, right, might be a vertical slice from top to bottom. And we're used to working in those, or some of us would prefer to work on those. But layers come into play, right, often, and especially in large corporations. So then you go to this other side of it, and you have a front-end team that does their work first, and then they hand off to a team that does the or sorry, you start off with a design team that does their work first, and then they hand off to an API team. One more time, sorry. Then they hand off to a front-end team that does the front-end framework stack. Then they hand off to an API team. Then they hand off to some people that are doing the database work. And that's not always how it's split out, right? But that's just one example. And then what that means, right, is at each stage of the process, at each layer of the process, there's humans. And so part of the experience then, when you're thinking about human-centered design in this realm of discovery and as DevOps practitioners, is you might just be building one of these layers, and your team might just be involved in one of these layers and even doing DevOps for one of these layers potentially. And so the humans that you're interested in are right here. Those are users that you have to be concerned with how we're going to use your stack. And again, the larger the company, the more this comes into play. But the other thing that we need to keep in mind is when we add a designer, for example, it comes in with a whole different set of needs, and that our vertical slice, even if we're doing the whole vertical slice, once a designer comes on our team, we at least have one layer, right? They're going to work on this part, and then existing team members maybe take it the rest of the way. Adding that layer means that we need to worry about this red line, this horizontal red line, that would be a handoff, that where the designer is going to hand off to maybe some front-end folks, or the front-end folks are going to hand off it to the designer, however it works. That is one of the key pieces that you want to talk about when you do discovery around adding design to DevOps. Is what is that handoff going to look like? What is it going to, what's the experience going to be like for both sets, disciplines of developers and designers, and how is the team going to support that, right? Because this is important, but it's easy to talk about that in a silo when what you're really expected to do from your stakeholders is keep this repeatable process of continuous integration, continuous deployment, why this new thing is happening. And that's what we're going to talk about, how we continue to implement that next. The next thing after we discover, maybe, if I can swipe to the next page, is we go to Distill. So once we get a discovery interface that's really solid, then we want to go to Distill, and we're going to take the output of discovery, take any drawings or artifacts that we have from discovery, right? And the goal of discovery, just to remind us again, is that gap. We want to make sure that we really align on what the gap is, or what the opportunity is, before we implement. And so when we go into Distill, we want to keep in mind that as we're taking that gap or that opportunity from discovery, our goal needs to be adding value instead of just replacing all the human intervention. So as DevOps folks, it's really important to use all the tools at our disposal to add the maximum amount of efficiency up to the level that it's the most valuable. So an example of that from our current client is that there needs to be some checks and balances legally between the people that write the code and the people that deploy the code. So instead of just automating the whole thing, we're basically asked to have at least one abstraction. And that is, for example, instead of just having a GitHub hook roll off the process to deploy to prod, we're asked to have some kind of metaphorical button that a human can press to deploy to prod, instead of just having a webhook or something kick off the process. So that would be an example of something that's valuable to our client legally. There needs to be a separation of concerns there. The people that press the button don't need to be experts at writing Jenkins pipelines or all those kind of deployment scripts. But if we pass that, right, if we refused to create that metaphorical button, we would be skipping over a large part of value and legal precedent of what they need. So that's an example of what I mean by not automating past the value. Excuse me. There's some assumptions here for Distill that your team's aligned during discovery. And so now solutions can flow freely because that opportunity or that gap is clear. If it's not clear, don't pass go, don't collect $100, that kind of a thing. Rules of thumb that have worked on other teams to align on this process. Automation sometimes like is seen as a straight path as the crow flies. Like if a plane is flying, for example, then it's a pretty straight line. If you're driving in a car, it's going to be zigzaggy. So sometimes we get stuck in that. How do we automate X, Y, Z? And the better question, right, is how do we create value for XYZ users? So how do we create value for the people that have to deploy this, or how do we create value for the customers that want to use the most up-to-date version of the software? Assuming that we're going to make something new, we're going to use that +1 style of discovery. DevOps touches many people's activities, and experience is part of that value or not. So we need to keep that in mind when we're implementing stuff and distilling stuff, that we don't want to distill past that either. And one of the ways we can understand how DevOps is going to interact with people is just doing a simple storyboard or outline. So, the storyboard, if you've ever done any kind of like, intro to film class in college or something like that, I mean, you're basically just drawing frames on a page, right? And you're going from one thing to another thing, from another thing. I mean, this goes to this, right? It's just a very linear idea. And you might have some kind of choose your own adventure in your DevOps process. Like if the tests fail, then it sends an email instead of kicking off the next step. I'm not saying that this needs to be a technical diagram to that directs on how to build this whole thing, but just the idea that this is the story of how people are going to use this and what it's actually going to do for your system with people in mind. So if we did this for real, right, for a design system, it would be something like maybe that there's some building blocks of a front-end UI. How are those going to get into a layout so that the front-end people can use them? How are they going to get the most up-to-date APIs? Right, so on and so forth, that you're just actually thinking through each step of the process to get from point A to point B before it's automated. It might be able to be simplified when it's automated. A design system, for those of you that haven't used it, is something I go pretty far into in that other video, and I hesitated to cut it out of this talk, but it's just a totally beast of a topic on its own. But a design system is this idea that instead of making pretty pictures that are unique snowflakes and saying, okay, this is a screen, make this, and now this is another screen, make this, and no, okay, we have another feature, here's another unique snowflake, make this. We're saying that there's a different way, and the different way is to make components. So, one might be a button, one might be a form, one might be a drop down, one might be a gallery, one might be a blog page, and that those, let me change the color here, and then those pieces go on to the layout, and that they're reused in different layouts. And so this part is what I'm calling a design system over here, and then that's applied to your layouts. So there's a lot of reasons to use this, and this talk is probably not the time for that. But the idea, right, is that if our opportunity and our gap is that we need to get design flowing into our system really rapidly, this is a way to do it, potentially one of the most efficient ways. And the reason that it's great is because it fits in with current DevOps rhythms, which is one kind of star, but the other star is that it gives designers control. So if they're saying, hey, this button needs to move 2 inches to the left or whatever, they're changing this on all of their design system stuff. And then that's rippling across the layouts of all the different pages. This workflow integrates with a lot of the modern design tools and is really helpful once you get into it. It's a bear to set up. Once you get into it, it's great. After we distill, we deliver. So once we get our solution packaged up, right, we've gone from first discovering, understanding the gap, then we've distilled, and we've gotten it down to a place where it's very concise. And then and we know what we're going to implement, and then we deliver and implement. The key things to remember here, right, is that we want our customers to be seeing more value and more value all the time. Our paychecks come from a need for business value, and if our customers aren't seeing more and more value, then we're spending a lot of sideways energy. We're not moving forward with our team. And so I think this is hard to present without getting super close to home. So I'm just going to go there. So assuming, right, you want to add a new screen, you have designers requirements that you need to meet. You want to keep your product owner happy with user engagement and keeping churn low on your subscriptions. You have all these other expectations, right, for your regular and the CI/CD processes that you've set up. That's the world that this is coming into then, right? So you have those designers requirements, you have all these expectations of your product owner. That's all coming into this world that you've set up for your CI/CD stuff and all those tools and processes. What could go wrong? And I think that's the thing that a lot of people skip over is like, it'll be good, we'll figure it out. But sometimes it's like mixing oil and water. If you're not doing the reduction part, right? If you're not really getting in there and understanding how it all connects, a lot could go wrong. So here's some examples, not to be grim, but just to kind of put them on the table. You might skip some user testing. So what the heck, not a big deal. It's important that somebody touches the design after it goes into code. And what happened on a project I worked on earlier that in 2019 was that the designer didn't have a development environment that they could access until after the pull request was merged. And so then it got into conversations where the designer's like, okay, now that I see it in the browser, I'd really like to change this and this and this. And the developers are like, well, we already merged the PR and closed the story and moved on. And so the first kind of argument or something like that was around who should be the people that accept the story, right? This is an agile language. Who should be the people that accept the story? Should it just be the product owner? Does designers get a voice in accepting the story? But really, the issue that I saw was that there wasn't an environment that we could deploy to before the PR got merged. Like we didn't have a place to put a feature branch out there where the designers had access to click around. And so that was something that I would suggest is that there's a way that user testing is kind of a formal term for it, right? But like there's a way for the designers to touch and feel what they've drawn before you've said, hey, this is ready to go. Another thing that could go wrong is missing a UI connection point. So designers more and more these days don't mock up everything. They just are doing the big chunks. And so if you have an existing thing, right, and you're doing this +1 discovery effort where you have a big thing, you're adding this feature on, if the designer has mocked up this, that's great, but there's still potentially connective tissue that's going to connect this new piece to the larger whole that wasn't thought of. And so that is really important, that there might be connective tissue that's not apparent in version 1 that y'all didn't consider, and it's nobody's fault, it just didn't get in there. And so that's another big reason to think about how you're going to deliver together and how you're going to meet all of these requirements together. It's a testament to your database management. So a problem that has been as old as time, so to speak, is that your code is starting in dev and going up to prod, or starting at local dev stage prod, and your database, most accurate version of your database is in prod, and it needs to come down to your local, right, dev stage. So does this actually happen? If this isn't happening well, right, then what could happen is, is down here, there might not be enough real-ish data to test with to actually see if the design works. Or up here, what could happen is that there's real data that breaks the new design because there wasn't enough data in the lower environments. And so I'm not saying it all has to come down to local. Maybe local is just, odds and ends. Heck, dev could be odds and ends. Maybe stage is where you're really aligning as a team. It doesn't have to be in your local environment, but just the idea of testing with data and how is your data managed, and do you have a strategy for that? And then the other thing that is really important to keep in mind is what happened with your development team's capacity. So if you have, Betsy, the designer here, and you have, your development team here, like who had to sit with Betsy to get Betsy's task done? And the idea and the assumption from product owners is that Betsy was just going to be able to do it by herself, but really in less mature processes, it normally takes a developer to hey, show me the code on your local to see how it looks or something like that, and that's not sustainable. And if that's happening, it can't go under the radar for too long, or else this whole team's going to burn out and get frustrated. So the idea of just being honest in retros and stuff like that, what did it really take to get this stuff out? And is that something that we're comfortable with doing for the long term, right? To do this for the foreseeable future, because that's our job, is to deliver continuous value and to help people create these artifacts that are going to stand the test of time. So to wrap up, we're the drill, right? This is the idea where our responsibility is to create processes that enable our team's artifacts to repeatedly add value, and we're really enablers in that way. And then as we go into this loop of how we're doing that, we need to discover clearly, we need to line on problems and opportunities before implementing. We move into distilling those things to optimize and automate the process without reducing value, right? So we look more towards value than just human intervention reduction. And then delivering, we really look at the needle and see our customers receiving more value and more value and more value, or are we spending sideways energy, and really being mindful of what's working and what's not. So that's a little bit about adding design to DevOps. Love to hear your questions, or join breakout sessions if that would be helpful.